While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Cybersecurity is unlike any other industry or environment I've ever covered, but more than the technology, the intriguing players, and the somewhat spooky elements surrounding it is how things we discuss on this podcast impact nearly every element of our day-to-day lives. It's not just how artificial intelligence is impacting email phishing schemes, but how clicking on that link could let a state-sponsored hacker steal login credentials or obtain access to an industrial control system that's not only used by a power tool manufacturer, but by a defense contractor or a water treatment facility. It's how bad actors are scrutinizing not just an enterprise, but an entire supply chain and looking for that one weak link that can be exploited for ransomware or a denial of service attack, and how shutting down that third-tier logistics provider could lead to exploits on healthcare or food and beverage offerings. The interconnected nature of the industrial sector makes an appreciation for cybersecurity vital to the ongoing safety and success of manufacturing, which again impacts nearly every facet of every person's daily life. That's why I enjoy talking to people like Aaron Schreiberg, Senior Team Leader at Flashpoint. They're a leading provider of threat landscape intelligence. The stuff Aaron talks about is frightening, which is another challenge of covering cybersecurity by trying to balance education with data sharing without fear-mongering as well. But I'd encourage you to really listen to Aaron as he talks about the evolution of threats from China, Russia, and Iran, and how cyber threats are converging with physical battlefields to fuel threats thousands of miles from where the missiles are flying. The bottom line is, we're all connected, and we're all impacted, so we all need to be prepared, regardless of how far removed you think you are. The good news, too, is that there are solutions, like sharing some of this scary information. And here to offer more on those insights is Aaron Schreiberg. So Aaron, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you stopping by Security Breach.
Of course, my pleasure.
Awesome. So maybe we can get things going a little bit. Our conversation out at RSA was kind of focused around a lot of things that you're up to and what you do on a day-to-day basis. Maybe we can just start there. You can fill the audience in a little bit on what your responsibilities are.
Sure, absolutely. So at Flashpoint, I work as the team lead for Team Eurasia. And essentially, this is a team that is combined with linguists who speak Russian, Chinese, other languages from basically across the world. And our primary mission really is to help support Flashpoint's corpus of open source collections from largely dark web communities. And by that, I mean communities that are largely engaged in illicit activity. So everything from e-crime type of fraud and other fraud activity. After that point, we also field questions, inquiries from different clients that we have around different threats that they're seeing, different signals that they're seeing, and we provide sort of that polished intelligence product to them so that they can understand more of the context of what they're seeing. So the emphasis is really on timely, actionable, relevant, and then most importantly, I think contextualized intelligence for our end users. So my day-to-day is kind of managing that team of linguists, analysts, making sure that they have all those that they have their priorities in line and that we're producing and running on all cylinders.
So you've definitely got your finger on the pulse of things that are going on out there, what the bad guys are up to. Maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the evolutions you've seen, whether it's been different tactics, different groups popping up, how they're functioning and operating, and how that kind of bleeds into what we're trying to do from a defensive side of things.
Sure, absolutely. So I think for me personally and professionally, my focus has largely been on China and the Chinese language ecosystem. And I think that's a really good microcosm of what we've seen across different other language ecosystems, let's say. So for example, China really only had the internet starting in like 1996, sort of mid-late 90s. The early sort of fraud ecosystem was a lot of let's say, maverick or actors that were not affiliated with the state. There was some hacktivism, some other incidents that took place. And then you started to see a gradual co-optation of a lot of those folks into the sort of that the government apparatus there. And then a lot of those folks, grew up, started families, had kids, and also started companies. And a lot of those companies also got sort of co-opted by the state. But I think most importantly in these cases for what we see today, just the gradual professionalization and sophistication of these groups over time, that's been something that I think has not gone unnoticed, and we've had to sort of adapt to as we work in the space. And I think a lot of that has kind of been magnified by what we're seeing recently with just the overall sort of sophistication, the growth of ecosystems like Telegram as a place where a lot of these activities take place. And then, of course, you layer on now AI and what that's sort of brought to the space as well. And you see just that sort of overall growth and sophistication, scale, and speed with which attacks can take place.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm assuming as things, got some hot spots right now geopolitically. When we look at Ukraine, we look at Iran. What are some of the things that you're seeing coming out of these particular environments or these actions, and how's that impacting some of the stuff you're seeing? I guess.
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting about Ukraine and now Iran is that I think we might typically think that a group, let's say an online cyber collective of some kind, might be aligned with one specific cause or one specific side of a conflict, and attack sort of the perceived enemy or adversary there. And what we've noticed, moving into this last Iran war situation, is that there are groups who seem to be reemerging and taking on a side and attacking one side's interest. To defend another's and so on. So it's been interesting to see sort of the flexibility of different groups and pursuing different target sets, and them not necessarily aligning with a sort of consistent ideological line, let's say. And then I think just the scale again and scope of cyber attacks alongside the kinetic activity that we're seeing, and the fact that those are seeming to be increasingly more coordinated, and you're getting as an end result sort of a picture of what the modern kind of battlefield looks like, right, with this convergence of cyber and kinetic at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about that. When we talk about this convergence and some of the factors driving it, is it just that this is just the natural evolution of things? Is it because of different vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are popping up, or what's sort of driving a lot of that combination or that convergence of different factors right now?
Yeah, I think just going back for 1 second, it's not just sort of online criminal groups or rogue actors that are carrying out these attacks. It is
Yeah.
state actors. So there are folks who are, aligned with a specific side, and they're attacking what they see as, perhaps critical infrastructure, systems, companies that can affect really kind of the lifeblood of an economy or even impact people's everyday lives. And so when you look back at some of the more high profile attacks that we saw with the attack on Stryker Medical Devices Company, I think therefore the side that was doing the attacks, they saw an opportunity and an ability to kind of impact people's day to day. And so I think that's one of the defining characteristics of these attacks, and one that I think is increasingly seen as an effective sort of use case, unfortunately for the modern day sort of conflict.
Yeah. It feels like there's a lot of basic things that we can do, and from a defensive position to at least make these things more difficult on the bad guys, make their jobs harder, or even shut them down from time to time. In your experience, what are maybe some of the basic, what I always refer to as the blocking and tackling, that we kind of miss, especially in the industrial side right now when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talk about just awareness, taking stock, and having a sense of like everything that could be a possible attack surface for the adversary. I think, not just waiting for things to happen, but
Yeah.
also proactively sort of seeking out any and all information we can get to have that decision advantage. And I think that's where Flashpoint or just the threat intelligence community just tends to provide a real benefit, because then you can see, okay, where are they talking about specific exploits in the wild? Are they mentioning specific company names, URLs, subdomains, and so on? And all that data is able to be observed and collected and searched against. I think some of the big challenges have just been, there's so much of it, so much noise to signal, and how do you pull it back and structure it and make it searchable in the first place? So I would say just looking for decision advantage through things like threat intelligence, I think can be a game changer for a lot of companies who are, to be fair, like overwhelmed, because there are just hundreds, if not thousands, of different potential vulnerabilities with different levels of severity. And so the question then becomes, how do we triage this? What do we prioritize? There's so many hours in the day, and what matters the most to us, right? And this sea of sort of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, we've talked about that before a little bit on the program, sort of prioritizing your crown jewels and understanding where all that comes into play. Are you seeing organizations getting better at that? Is that still a big challenge for them in terms of setting those priorities? Because, man, once you start digging in, it can feel overwhelming.
Yes, and I think a lot of folks would be surprised to see that, even the biggest, most well-resourced and sophisticated companies may not always be aware of everything that they have under the hood, so to speak, all their crown jewels or all of the sort of follow-on technologies and other areas that could be vulnerable. And that includes
Yeah,
third parties and partners as well. I mean,
yeah.
as an initial access vector, I mean, going from, a managed service provider eventually to that sort of bigger fish, so to speak, at least from the attacker's vantage point. I mean, that could be one area that is just harder to get a grasp onto. But I do think there's been progress overall across the board. I mean, especially in the years that I've been in this industry, where there's just this growing appreciation, and especially now with a lot of the headlines around, what we're seeing in the recent wars, and then also, of course, larger revelations like the rise of dark GPTs, malicious AI use cases, and then of course probably most recently the issue of mythos kind of coming to the fore as well. So definitely a growing awareness and appreciation, and I think there's considerable action as well as follow on.
You mentioned earlier how you're managing a lot of these, Telegram, a lot of areas on the dark web. Not to give away too much secret sauce of what Flashpoint is all about, but how do you? I would think if anybody went on there, just them individually, and started checking that out, it would just be overwhelming with a lot of the troubling things that
Yeah.
you would see there. What is your approach strategically in terms of understanding how to go in there, understand what's important, trying to stay away
Mhm.
from the things that are not?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And, the ultimate challenge here, I think, is you do have the scale, you have the signal to noise. When you're in illicit communities where folks are, intent on doing bad things, you're going to have all kinds
Yeah.
of different kinds of noise. And navigating that is always going to be a challenge. I think that having the right people in place with the right training, having the right support system in place from just a personnel standpoint, because is sometimes a difficult place to be in and to stomach. The immense responsibility and load that people feel when they're, in charge of protecting, which is our kind of core mission at Flashpoint. There is kind of an architecture that I think is ideal to kind of help steward that process along. But then I think also, the technological solutions that have come to the fore. I mean, the collections engine that we have, the ability to, even do things as unexciting as deduplicate similar or like results, right? And kind of be able to whittle things down to a point where, you know what to home in on, what's the low density, high interest stuff that really matters. So kind of all of that, I think, working together has helped to get us to where we are. And then we supercharge that with, some of the large language model technologies and AI. And I think we're able to then kind of fight fire with fire because the fact is, that the threat actors are also using AI, which is obviously a huge concern right now. But I think that the thinking within the industry too is that, we have to kind of, again, fight fire with fire and start using AIs in creative ways to solve some hard problems.
Absolutely. I want to circle back to AI, but one of the things that keeps coming to mind too, and you talk about all this noise out there, and there's all of this disruption and people chatting about stuff, and some of them are just basically just saber rattling a little bit to try to get some attention. Others are very
Yeah.
real threats. When we look at that from a manufacturing environment, you've got all of these different things setting off different alarms. That
Mhm.
fatigue and constantly being on guard, if you will, can be exhausting and sort of leads people to maybe not paying attention to things like they should. What advice would you have in terms of helping organizations to sort of guard against that alert fatigue and helping them to really sort through some of this noise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like information sharing is always going to be important.
Yeah.
We'll get a specific signal or a question from somebody around something, and uh, just on a little bit of looking, we might find, okay, that's something that's a little bit of FUD, a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, a little bit of saber rattling. And
Yeah.
so being able to sort of, you know, lend credibility to a threat and say, oh yeah, this is something you should focus on is very important. And then at the same time, being able to say, okay, this doesn't seem that credible, and to be able to allow people to move on from that quickly and focus on what matters. That's also very, very critical. So, but in the alerting sense, I mean, it is a perennial issue and problem, and it does keep folks kind of up late at night and at work long hours. I think there is so much that we can do from a technological standpoint and adding in additional signals, additional information to be able to triage and make decisions. I mentioned, the discussion of specific CVs in the wild or by specific groups. At the same time, I think more resourcing towards some of these issues and the personnel support that's needed. I think that's something that is being looked at, and I think will continue to be, but especially now. There's no silver bullet to solving these problems, but I think just continuing the conversation and building the support needed is definitely central to where we are now and where we're going to be in the coming months and years.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up resources. And just to be clear there, we're not just talking about throwing money at a problem and buying a bunch of tools and everything else. It's the training that you mentioned before and everything else. When it
Absolutely.
comes to getting those resources, what type of tactics have you found have been most successful in sort of getting that up the food chain, helping people to understand how important cybersecurity is, but maybe without freaking them out? We don't want to shock and scare everybody, but there's a way to get people on board. What's been your experience there?
Definitely. Yeah, and again, love working at Flashpoint because I think we really have a great way of communicating up, down, and across the organization. The importance of everything from phishing, business email compromise, what to watch out for. Don't act on that text message from your CEO asking you to go out and buy all those gift cards. And they've done it in a way that's really made it fun and interesting, and it sticks, right? It's like, you know, even if it's bad advertising, it's still advertising. It's good advertising because it's memorable. In our case, it's fun to be able to learn about good cyber hygiene and what you can do as an individual, because the human factor is, again, as it's really always been, has been kind of the weakest link in all of this. But just getting people day to day to kind of be security minded, not overly paranoid, and not something that would sort of become a blocker, but just striking that balance between business efficacy and security, right? So convenience versus security has always been kind of a struggle and a tension, but I think there's a happy medium that can be achieved, I think it of course depends on your organization and what the stakes are for you, what your industry is, and so on, and that can all be thought through and figured out company to company, really.
Well, it's really interesting because a lot of this, whether it's the sort of starting your program or understanding where to go or something like training, it is understanding those priorities, establishing those first. That seems to be such a vital first step in really moving forward and creating that culture that we need, not just in the organization, but really throughout the industry.
Yeah, and you mentioned priorities, and I think that's very, very important. One thing that we've rolled out in the last few months at Flashpoint is priority intelligence requirements, or PIRs. There's a lot of acronyms out there. This is one of my favorites because it really does define kind of that starting point for any organization is, what do you care about? What are the things that are the most vulnerable, the most likely to be attacked? How could an adversary, take advantage of different aspects of your business, your partnerships, your supply chain, and so on. So establishing those initial requirements, I think, is a great thought exercise and can ultimately result in, concrete actions that your organization takes that they might not otherwise have. And that is definitely a great, great starting point.
Absolutely. I want to circle back a little bit on some of the nation state stuff that's going on because it feels like a lot of these state sponsored hackers are going after targets that have I won't even say military, but even a social or conflict element to them in terms of who they're targeting. But then there's a ton of collateral damage, if you will, in terms of whether it's an industrial control system or whatever the case may be. What's been your experience there? And I want to talk about this because I think there's a lot of small to medium-sized manufacturers who feel like I'm nowhere near the Middle East. This is not going to affect me. I don't operate in Northeastern Asia or anything else or Northwestern Asia. But maybe you could talk about some of that fallout that does come from some of these things that are going on with these state-sponsored hackers.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I mentioned Stryker earlier, and I'll touch on that
Yeah.
briefly. So, medical device company, a huge company, global company, lots of high net worth individuals work for those companies. They
Yeah.
invest in different things. When something like this happens, it really does send a chilling effect through the whole company, and folks will start making different decisions that they wouldn't have made before. Maybe less risky decisions, less investment decisions. I mean, you can feel cascading effects of that, right down to the type of investments that people will make in that environment. And then at the same time, like I think, you know, if you look at different compromises, like for example, Colonial Pipeline or other attacks on critical infrastructure, um, you know, you might be targeted as an initial access vector to get to that larger company that could affect, the flow of things like oil or other critical infrastructure related products or commodities. And so this is all to say that, like, you know, you don't necessarily want to be the one that is kind of the step to getting to that endpoint of a major compromise of a large critical infrastructure type of company. And I think also just recognizing that, like, yeah, like, you could potentially be that target. And then the follow-on effects would be obviously severe, but then you could also be impacted by the attack on a much larger system or architecture that you rely on. Um, but yeah, I think for small and medium-sized companies and smaller businesses, I mean, I think as a first line of defense in some cases, just having that cyber hygiene, that education, that ability to kind of prioritize in your own way that meets kind of your scale. I think that's a great first step because some folks might not be doing it at all. But I think just trying that out and getting on board with kind of some standard practices is definitely like a great step that everyone should be taking and maintaining that awareness as well as to what kind of the threat landscape is that day. And all of this information, I mean, it's not, you might think that it's only for people who are paying, high tier subscriptions to companies or something like that. But you can open up any newspaper, go online, and you can really find out a lot just through simple searches and pulling back information. So I think the curiosity and the initiative, I think, is very important in this case.
Yeah, well, especially when you look at supply chains getting more and more entangled and complex, it only takes one person in or one entity within that supply chain to be hacked and be shut down. Has wide-ranging effects, and then there's always the potential to worm into different companies because of all those interconnections.
Yeah, and I mentioned Stryker and then Colonial Pipeline. I mean, as one sort of example, I would say, you look at companies in Japan, for example. There was an attack on Asahi Brewery
Yeah,
a while back, caused significant shutdowns. A few years ago, there was an attack on a series of Toyota companies, a ransomware attack that shut down, I think, over a dozen plants in the country
yeah.
for a good amount of time. And so if you look at just these different isolated cases globally, I mean, you can begin to get a sense of like what the impact would be. And learning from those experiences as best you can, looking at, the announcements that are coming out of those companies themselves, any kind of investigations. Again, I think information sharing in these cases is really critical. And that's on the part of the individual who's tasked with protecting to go out and find as much as they can and learn as much as they can from those instances.
Absolutely. Oh, you mentioned AI earlier. Well, we got to circle back on that. We have to have that
Yeah.
conversation, of course. I mean, right now, everything that's going on with Claude is definitely sort of dominating that space and that conversation. But I think for manufacturers, that just muddies the water even more when it comes to
Mhm.
understanding the right ways to use AI. We know the bad guys are using it. We know there's opportunities for the good guys to use it. What is your advice in terms of sorting through, again, a lot of the noise that's out there and finding a solution that's right for you?
Yeah. So there again, I think when you look at all the different AI assisted techniques that threat actors are using, a lot of it is the same that we've seen in the past. It's just that now it's faster and it's more scalable. So I know that does muddy the water significantly, and it just sort of layers on an additional, pressure in terms of like, what are we going to do now that, there's additional attacks being carried out faster and more frequently. But I think, again, focusing on, what one has like in-house, knowing where your attack surfaces are, what the vulnerabilities are, and then kind of walking things back from there. That will help kind of with triage and with organization and not getting, swept up in some of the, let's face it, hype that surrounds some of the AI attack types that are coming out. Not to water those down and downplay those, but I do think that there's still a lot one can do just within the confines of traditional cybersecurity practices and defenses that will position you very well, and then use AI to your advantage. I mean, there's a lot of options to use at some scale to be able to triage and understand your attack surface and so on. So um, yeah, I think overall, like, maintaining that awareness, but also knowing that there's ways that you can, use AI to your own advantage. That's an important sort of balance to try and strike as a network defender or as a security practitioner.
Yeah, I think the important thing to differentiate there is it's a tool, it's not a crutch. I think people become too
Mhm.
dependent on AI sometimes. I also think
Mhm.
it's important to see some of these basic things that we've talked about here, which can be very time consuming, very resource consuming, such as
Mhm.
inventorying all of your assets. AI can be a huge help there. Establishing those priorities or identifying those crown jewels, AI can be a great tool for something like that and getting started. So definitely some great
Yep,
uses
definitely.
there. One thing I wanted to pick your brain, and I know this is a big topic and you could probably talk for a long
Mhm.
time on this, but just generally
Mhm.
speaking, what's some of your observations or opinions on everything that's kind of been involved with the Mythos fallout from Claude and all those vulnerabilities that are popping up now? What are you seeing, or what kind of effect do you think that's going to have?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see the fallout or the impact, the ripple effects across the industry.
Yeah.
Again, as sort of a China specialist that spent years in the open source world and also working in threat intel, again, there is some interesting parallels between, I think what Mythos is and what it's trying to achieve, which is, this sort of idea of here's when you look at something like Glasswing, here's access to this tool that can tell you all these vulnerabilities you have. I think Firefox actually was one company that quickly patched, a lot of vulnerabilities in their browsers following having access to Mythos. One thing that I've noticed, I think, is similar between Mythos and let's take a country like China is, this idea of the industrialization of the ability to, quickly find different vulnerabilities in different software, different technology. I think in China, one thing that they've done is implemented regulations, for example, the regulation on the management of severe vulnerabilities. And what this is essentially done is said any security researcher who finds a vulnerability has to first report it to the state before they report it to like your traditional sort of open source agencies or organizations. And so a lot of those vulnerabilities are then reported to the state, and they can effectively then become, weaponized because that knowledge is not shared outside of the state. And that has kind of enabled them to build up this sort of closed system where they could potentially attack using knowledge that only they have and could do it at scale. And so what I'm getting at is that, I think as Mythos or as the myth of Mythos kind of permeates the dark web, you might see folks who come up with copycat technologies or try and develop, specific instances of their own sort of open Mythos based on what they believe Mythos is. And we've already seen some reports of leaks, of Mythos in the open surface web, right? Um, but you have basically, like we did when ChatGPT came out, this sort of echo effect where the word gets out, folks start to develop sort of copycat type technologies or things that promise to be able to do the same thing. In the case of the communities that we monitor, the illicit communities, it's like they're trying to advertise similar tools that could be maybe, as impactful, right? We don't know if they are, but I think we're already seeing traces of that begin to emerge. And a lot of questions coming in from folks asking, what's going on with this with Mythos, and why I'm hearing about, a random Discord group or a copycat or an alleged copycat who has a Mythos tool of their own that they're advertising or releasing. So yeah, through the lens of the threat intelligence community, I think those are the types of signals that we start to see, and we're getting a lot of questions around just what the impacts are going to be, and not pretending that we have all the answers is important here because things are moving very fast, and it's an ongoing situation. I would say for us as a company at Flashpoint, we have a huge trove of different vulnerabilities that have not yet been released by NVD. A lot of folks may be aware of the winding down of the National Vulnerability Database and a lot of the information that folks traditionally historically relied on now being not as available. So, as researchers, we're trying to fill that gap and provide the information that folks still might need. And then I'd say when it comes to Mythos, I mean, the existence of a lot of these vulnerabilities as like white box type vulnerabilities is important to point out. I know for a lot of like manufacturers with different air gapped systems, some of those those technologies or those software, they may not be something that is publicly known or shared. And then that's not something that I think, therefore, that might be susceptible to something like Mythos. Not to say it is or isn't, but I think that that's an important kind of distinction to call out at this point.
No, that's a great point. And it feels like this was inevitable. It was going to happen at some point with some platform. And even though there's a lot of short-term pain, I think long-term, this is actually going to be very beneficial in terms of understanding some of the risk that's out there and associated with these platforms. And again, being a bit more measured. I wouldn't say slow down, but be more measured in your adoption rates and how you're using it too. So some lessons to learn there.
Yeah, agreed.
Aaron, this has been awesome. Really appreciate it. And I know I asked this question when we were out in Vegas, and you gave one of the most honest responses I've ever gotten. But when you're listening to all this threat noise, you're on top of things that are going on in a hot spot like China. How do you sleep at night? What are some things that give you some respite or actually help you to get some sleep? Because there's a lot of bad stuff that you're exposed to.
And I think the answer I gave you was that I don't sleep very much, and that might impact the eloquence and the smoothness of my answers to your question. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge is you spend a lot of time in the information space, a lot of time kind of understanding and figuring things out. And, one of the skills I like to teach my team and encourage them is public speaking and communication, because you could know something very important, but then how do you get that not just to your peers and your managers, but all the way up the chain. And so, it's, I think I'm encouraged by the fact that everyone I meet in my field, and especially at our company, is just so passionate about security and so interested and curious in where we are right now historically. And, that's kind of what the excitement of the work itself keeps us going. And then also, obviously staying humble and recognizing that our job is to protect. And, we're definitely doing all we can, but staying open to feedback and continuing to kind of evolve and adapt and change with the times as we're doing, right now as we speak. I think that's key. So yeah, have some great colleagues and good support. And I think, again, across the industry, I think the culture is pretty healthy, and hopefully will stay that way.
No, I couldn't agree more. The passion comes through just in the folks we talk to on the podcast and really at the trade show and whenever I have these conversations, that does come through, and it's encouraging, especially when you mentioned the vulnerability database, not getting the same sort of resource allocation. There's some stuff going on with CISA as well that could impact folks on a day-to-day. So being able to get out there, share this information like you have mentioned a couple different times, and that's definitely the soapbox I'll die on as well, as we do need to get this information out and just be more transparent at times with some of these attacks, the attackers, and everything else that's going on. So absolutely, that passion plays a big part of it. Last one, wrapping up here, Aaron, again, thank you so much for the time. Any other trends that you're seeing that could really have a big impact on cybersecurity as we move ahead here?
We mentioned AI and agentic, of course. I think, just the growth in the different communities and the pivot from, traditionally open communities to maybe more closed sources. I know it's another thing that we can all be concerned about and keep us up at night, but, noticing actors kind of moving, to signal groups or to Telegram groups that are closed, how the threat is kind of migrating across the information space. I think that's something that, we've been keeping a close eye on. And then, just the growth in, or let's say, the renaissance, for better or for worse, in folks who are not just, getting into cybersecurity and being able to create more and produce more, obviously with the help of AI, but also on the flip side, the number of threat actors and groups that are experimenting with different tools and techniques, and, maybe trying to do it in a way that is not innocuous or innocuous, but just the effects of that, I think, across the information space that we observe. That's something that, we're going to continue to track. So yeah, there's just a lot more to kind of to watch and understand. So
thanks, Aaron. And for more information on Flashpoint, you can check them out at flashpoint.io. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. ien.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Aaron Schraberg, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.